Sweden used to have a very active punk rock scene between the end of the 70s and up until the 2000s. But all things must pass, and punk rock is long since gone. Or is it? Today I'm going on a punk rock cruise on the Baltic Sea. Welcome to the Close-Up Punk Cruise, 40 hours of partying and listening to the very best punk bands that Sweden has to offer. Let's explore what you can find on this cruise, and let me tell you a little bit about the history of punk rock. In the 1960s and the early 70s, the term punk rock was used to describe garage rock bands and glam rock bands like Iggy and the Stooges and New York Dolls. But that's not what we typically mean when we say punk rock. The punk that we all love or hate usually refers to bands from the mid-70s, such as Sex Pistols, The Ramones, The Clash, and Buzzcocks. That's where the punk subculture emerged, with its provocative clothes, provocative music, and even more provocative messages. From the 70s, punk branched out into multiple subgenres, such as hardcore punk, anarcho-punk, skatepunk, and a lot more. But what I'm gonna focus on today is the history of punk in Sweden. Punks are known for being anarchistic, but Swedes are known for standing in line. So what you get here is a very strange combination. Punk rock came to Sweden at the end of the 1970s, a few years after the movement started in the UK. Back then, punk wasn't about specific messages like anti-racism or anti-commercialism. Back then, it was more about anti-culture in general. The summer of 1977 has been described as the summer of hate, to contrast with the summer of love 10 years earlier during the hippie movement. That was also a year that was very important for Swedish punk history. That's the year when the band Ebba Grön started to play. Ebba Grön was the code phrase used by the Swedish police in 1977 when they arrested the terrorist leader Norbert Kröcher. It's also by far the most famous punk band in Sweden. They released 3 albums between 1978 and 1982, and it's literally impossible to find a single Swedish person who hasn't heard of at least some of their songs. Do you know of the band Ebba Grön?
Yes, of course.
Do you know any Ebba Grön songs?
Yeah, I guess so.
Can you name any?
Staten och kapitalet.
Everyone knows it, right?
Yeah.
Have you heard of any Ebba Grön songs?
Yeah.
Can you sing any?
No.
I think my point is proven. Ebba Grön consisted of 3 angry lads from a suburb of Stockholm called Rågsved, but there were other bands as well emerging during that time.
Punk rock is the fucking best rock in the world. I'm like a Kosambi fan, and if you don't know Kosambi, check out Kurtsunes med Berit on YouTube. It will blow your mind.
KSMB called their music scream rock rather than punk rock, and they refused to be part of the Swedish punk scene. They were anti-commercialist and anti-right-wing, and a little bit of anti-everything, which of course means that they're definitely punk. They played off and on between 1978 and all the way up until 2017, and a total of 32 different people have been band members at one time or another. Asta Kast was another very influential band that started in 1982, and they're actually still active. More or less. The themes of their songs range from stuff like anti-consumerism to anti-nuclear power to quite silly stuff. And fun fact, there was a German band called Rasta Knast who made Asta Kast covers, singing in very broken Swedish. During those early years of the late 70s and the early 80s, there were many other important bands. For example, Attentat, Grisen Skriker, Living Sacrifice, Kriminella Gitarrer, and Incest Brothers. More bands emerged in the 80s, for example Köttgrottorna, Karta 77, Odör, and Coca-Carola. Those bands were all Stockholm-based, and the music started to align itself into a subgenre of punk rock, a type of Stockholm punk. But in other parts of the country, things took a different turn. Some people wanted a rougher and more raw sound, and bands like Anticimex and Mob 47 gave it to them. The international term for this subgenre is Swedish hardcore, but in Swedish is called crust or Skatepunk. Mob 47 was actually from Stockholm, but most of the other influential hardcore bands came from other cities like Gothenburg and Malmö. Bands like Moderat Likvidation, Totalitär, and Avskum emerged during that time and became quite popular. But the people in the frigid north really took a liking to hardcore. Umeå is a town up north that really became synonymous with Swedish hardcore for a while. Refused and Raised Fist are two bands that got started in Umeå in the 90s, and you may even have heard of those names today. Not everyone wanted a rougher sound though. Swedish hardcore got a lot of influences from skatepunk in the US, and that led to the creation of many prominent Swedish skatepunk bands. Satanic Surfers, Millencolin, and No Fun At All are some good examples of Swedish skatepunk bands that got started in the 90s. Skatepunk is very melodic, but it actually has its roots in hardcore. But let's go back to Stockholm to see what happened with the music there in the 90s.
Tjena, jag heter... Jag vet inte vad jag heter. Vad är du? Vilket jävla drägg ni har med på filmen, eller?
Are you a long-term punk fan?
Well, yes, I think you can say that. From the beginning of 93.
Do you have any favorite punk band?
Well, no, I suppose. Yes, I have. Björnarna.
There was a new wave in the Swedish punk scene during the 90s, and at the forefront of that wave was DLK, De Lyckliga Kompisarna. De Lyckliga Kompisarna means the happy friends, and they played a type of punk called trallpunk, a very melodic type of punk rock. The songs often had humorous lyrics, and they were upbeat and accessible. They were still punk songs though, with political messages. However, their absolutely biggest hit was a silly song about how everyone had hockey hair back in the 90s. Other bands in the trallpunk genre includes Radioaktiva Räkor, Racerbajs, and Krymplings. Trallpunk stayed strong all through the 90s and into the early 2000s, and there were lots of different labels releasing lots of different bands. But one very interesting series of albums that I need to mention is Definitivt 50 spänn, definitely 50 Swedish crowns. They were a set of CDs released between 1992 and 2004, and every CD cost exactly 50 Swedish crowns, which is pretty damn cheap. They were a collaboration between different small labels that wanted to share their small bands with a wider audience. Everyone who had any interest in punk rock listened to Definitivt 50 spänn. That was the way to find out about new exciting small bands for a cheap price. Let me give you a tour of my room as well. Look at this, it's spacious but not very luxurious. There's beds. I'm gonna be alone here with 4 beds, or 3 beds and a sofa. And I have a bathroom, that's good to have. Not too shabby. Not the best I've slept in, but not the worst. Swedish punk emerged at the end of the 70s, and it basically branched out into 3 different genres by the 90s: hardcore, skatepunk, and trallpunk. This is just my take on it, and I look forward to seeing a lot of hateful comments about how I don't know anything about punk. To that, I just have one thing to say. So what happened after the 90s and the early 2000s? Punk must have died out, right? Well, not quite. Sure, punk isn't exactly topping the charts anymore, but it's far from dead. Many of the old bands are still out there playing gigs, and new bands are popping up every year. On this boat you can see Karta 77 and Köttgrottorna, for example, celebrating 40 years of playing punk. And you can also see Coca-Carola, De Lyckliga Kompisarna and Krymplings, as well as newer talents such as Toxic Lab Rats, Mimikry and Korslagda Kukar. But there is a difference. Punk in Sweden isn't young and hungry anymore. Punk's not dead, but it got old and gentrified. The messages are still political and anti-establishment, but it's mostly from a love of the genre and from its traditions these days. Many of those angry kids from the 70s grew up to become upstanding citizens, living pleasant lives in central Stockholm. It's hard to be angry at the world when you actually have a pretty good life. You might be wondering what a pretentious bastard like me is doing on a punk cruise. Well, I wasn't always a geeky computer nerd with a passion for travel. When I was young, I was a geeky computer nerd with a passion for travel who also played in a punk band. We sucked. We sucked really badly, but we had a lot of fun. And I think that's why I love punk rock so much. You can scream your frustration at everything that's wrong with the world, and you can have a lot of fun while doing it. And there you have it. That was a very quick look at the history of punk rock in Sweden, and also the close-up punk cruise. I hope you found it interesting. Now I need to get more drunk. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day. Oh, and check out this video as well. It should be up here in the corner somewhere.